Mary Wollstonecraft's Influence and Importance. So Mary Wollstonecraft is known as like the first feminist, basically. She started this revolution on the idea of reasoning. Um, Her ideas become the base of the first feminist wave movement. You see her ideas very present at the end of the 19th and the early of 20th century, and her ideas of women's education are seen very clearly in the first feminist wave. So Mary Wollstonecraft um, started her career out as a teacher. It's important to note here that Wollstonecraft was afforded the bare minimum of formal education at the time, but was able to make connections in a more uh, wealthy political social sphere that allowed her to further her education herself. Um, and she used it to create a school that eventually closed, and she became a governess, and then eventually became a writer. She published her first book, Thoughts on the Education of Daughters. She was born middle class due to her grandfather's wealth in the silk business in London. She wrote children's books, she wrote literature reviews, and then she wrote some of her greatest life's work. She died 10 days after childbirth to her second daughter, Mary Shelley, who's most notably known as the author of Frankenstein, um, due to an infection. So, women's rights is realistically what we're discussing today. Um, Women's rights are the fundamental human rights that promote a position of social and legal equality for women. They were enshrined by the UN 70 years ago and gave women rights for education, the right to vote, the right to a fair wage, and the right to live free from discrimination and violence. Women's rights in the mid 18th century were very limited. The 18th century is a very patriarchal structure, so husbands, fathers, brothers, basically any masculine figure in a woman's life represented the woman in their lives in the political and social spheres. Their education was limited based on economic position, so the bare minimum of a woman's education was day school. But if you were wealthy, you were able to read, you could further your education yourself. Um, Generally, women's education past the bare minimum was domestic training, um, like laundry, cooking, needlework. Uh, the 18th century, however, was filled with these ideas of women's education and rights, but they were still somehow seen as dependents, unable to control their own money, own property, vote, and sign legal documents. All of these tensions and all that led to Wollstonecraft writing her biggest work, A Vindication of the Rights of Women. Uh, Written in mid 18th century Europe in 1792 was the date Euro was published. So, a brief synopsis of it would be a declaration of female independence and ability. Wollstonecraft discusses this idea of equality and decorative womanhood and female stereotypes. She discusses the empowerment of women in society, marriage, and education, and their right to be in the political and social sphere. She is an Enlightenment thinker, so she has ideas of individualism and putting faith in reason. She argues that women and men, although share some biological differences, were at equal part intellectually, and that intellectual development is what leads to developed reasoning, and that if women were afforded the same opportunities to develop their intelligence, they would be equal with men in terms of reason, and goes even as far as, and this is controversial time, to say that women would be afforded the right to vote because they would be at equal par. So the key ideas of this writing, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, which is not her first publication, and it comes after a publication called A Vindication of the Rights of Man. She has three really major points. She argues that the lack of education impedes a woman's development intellectually and traps them in a domestic sphere. She argues that women and men, although biologically different, are equal par intellectually, and that should women have the equitable opportunity to develop their intelligence, they would be at equal par with men, and that intellectual development is what leads to developed reasoning, and that should be women be given this equal opportunity, they should be allowed many things, such as the right to vote. That lack of education of women is what's barring the rights of women in society, basically. And then you have here a few quotes. One of her most famous quotes from A Vindication of the Rights of Women is that all of the sacred rights of humanity are violated by insisting on blind obedience. Wollstonecraft wrote a lot of writings, but her key arguments being that equity and equality are rights that every person should have, and that by not allowing women to have education, you trap them where they are. We still see these ideas today. So, the first feminist wave is where you see a lot of Wollstonecraft's ideologies. So, Abigail Adams, the wife of John Adams, as well as Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Mott, they all campaigned for the rights of women in 19th century America, but they also admired Wollstonecraft and read her readings, and kind of her Wollstonecraft's influence really drives many of their main arguments. So Wollstonecraft, as we've talked about, is seen as the mother of feminism. But according to Sandine Bergs, the vindication came back into favor at the end of the 19th century, kind of in the beginning of the 20th with the suffragettes, who really started to push this idea of Wollstonecraft as the mother of feminism, because so many of their ideas aligned with Wollstonecraft's writings. So they kind of saw it as their Bible of sorts. It was a writing of educational reform, but it also clearly, like the Wollstonecraft's writings clearly state that she's in favor of women's right to vote, which, when you think about the first feminist wave and the suffragettes, that is their main fight. Influential first wave feminists such as Virginia Woolf and Susan B. Anthony is really where you see a lot of Wollstonecraft's influence. Virginia Woolf, one of the most famous writers of the first feminist wave, she has pretty radical ideas, but her ideas and Wollstonecraft's ideas of a role of women in society and the rights of women to have education are a very clear connect. And then you see a really direct connection to Susan B. Anthony. Woolf states influence on Wollstonecraft, but Susan B. Anthony republishes A Vindication of the Rights of Women in her newspaper, The Revolution. And by republishing this, because A Vindication of the Rights of Women was so old and it was very limitedly published, by republishing her writings, Susan B. Anthony gave rise to a new understanding of Wollstonecraft by just providing feminist thinkers her writings in the first place. So, in order to really measure Wollstonecraft's influence on the first feminist wave and even today, really the easiest way to do that is just to see the similarities between Wollstonecraft's writings, specifically A Vindication of the Rights of Women, and the fights of the first feminist wave movement. So one of the main fights, other than voting, would be the rights to an education, which is the main basis of many of Wollstonecraft's works, including her first one. The lack of access to education, barring women from their natural rights, is really an idea of Wollstonecraft's that you just see so heavily in the suffragettes' fights for women's education. And then the similarities of men and women, although there are many biological, there are also very differences. There's also so many similarities. and then just the general concepts of equity and equality that you see present in not only feminist waves, but also in Wollstonecraft's writings. So, like I said, when measuring influence, it's a little difficult. But you see Wollstonecraft today. She's so talked about as the mother of feminism or the first feminist. And she, in 2020, had a statue erected of her in Newington Green, London. And then when you see feminist writings and signs and their protests and their blog posts and all this stuff, you see women and feminist thinkers over and over again quote Wollstonecraft. Um, and one of her most famous quotes is, "I do not wish women to have power over men, but for women to have power over themselves." And you see it. You see it all the time. Um, Even in some of the most recent fights, you see people quoting uh, this quote basically. So a lot of feminist theorists, like, are very prominent ones. Did they talk about Wollstonecraft's writings and interviews? Um, and she has such a clear historical influence. But finding references to her in feminist theory and feminist writings of current day is really, really hard. Mostly because feminist writings today, and this has been a combination over time, is are very jargon, and they're just really hard to read. But also because Wollstonecraft is just not directly quoted, but you see her ideas in these writings all over the place. Because her main argument of equity being a human right, and how by barring women and marginalized people from education, you're barring them from their rights, and this idea that, you know, marginalization of communities is, so structured in society. You see all of that in Wollstonecraft's writings, outside of a vindication of the rights of women. But when they don't directly quote her, it makes it really hard to really see Wollstonecraft's influence unless you have a really good working knowledge of Wollstonecraft's writings. So the main point of this project was really to measure Wollstonecraft's influence and basically determine if her influence is as much as we think it is, or if she even had influence in general. And she was influential in many feminist waves, predominantly in the first feminist wave. She kind of drops off at the second. But you still see her writings being quoted today in feminist arguments, but it's very much so less. Um, and it's really hard to measure influence in the first place. To measure like a specific person like Wollstonecraft's influence, even in like places like the first feminist wave where you can see it just so clearly, and people are really republishing her works for consumption. It's really hard to measure her influence unless you're well versed in her writings, and it's really hard to like kind of educate people on her influence unless you really do an in-depth explanation of who she was and of pretty much all of her writings, because they're all very synonymous with each other. They all have a really a lot of the same core ideologies. And she's a hard person to read. It's the mid 18th century. But unless you're like really well versed in Wollstonecraft's writings, it's really hard to see her influence. It's really hard to teach it. So I guess just take it from me. It's there. Thank you so much for listening. Here are my sources. So a lot of them are on Wollstonecraft's life and that kind of stuff. But also, I spend a lot of time going through a vindication of the rights of women. It took me a really long time. It's a very, the writing style of the 18th century is a little hard to read. It took a while. But also I use this really good source called The Civil Existence, where it takes these writings in which people directly quote Wollstonecraft that are, more current and more modern writings. And, they directly quote her, they directly use her ideas, and it really helps give an idea of her influence.